What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another modern video. And this week we're going to be taking a look at a deck that attacks the modern metagame the way that I like my modern decks to attack the meta. And that is being equal parts fast and able to be disruptive to the combo decks, while also being able to apply the right pressure to some of the other slower decks in the format that want to doodle around and mess around with convoluted like chains and combos and stuff like that, like the 4-color control decks, and so on and so forth. So today we're going to be taking a look at Grixis Death Shadow for Modern and just basically going in depth on why I like the deck and the parts and things that, really keep me coming back to really looking at this deck and even at some points playing it and giving it another go. So let's go ahead, jump over and take a look at the deck. So here we have the Grixis Death Shadow deck piloted by Mikathara 1994. Took it to a 4-0 finish, good enough for first place in the Modern Preliminary on November 18th, of 2022. Before we get too deep into the deck and of course talk about the ins and outs and the fact that I've spent way too much time playing decks like this, I would appreciate it if you supported my channel by subscribing and of course ringing the notification bell so you know when I post videos such as this and other videos on the Modern and Pioneer format, and some other competitive type videos kind of mixed in, hopefully here soon as I get the time for it. Of course, there is a link in the description to the Discord server that I run that I would love to interact and talk with more people about the Modern format, Pioneer, and just Magic in general, because that's something I really love to do. With that quick shilling out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at Grixis Death Shadow. Of course, the namesake of the deck, Death Shadow. Death Shadow is one of the most interesting creatures in the Modern format and has been for a long time, just for its odd ability and the fact that it is a 1 mana 13/13, which is huge, obviously for on rate, but it gets -X, where X is your life total. So if you're at 12 life, this gets -12, making it a 1 mana 1/1. So the deck has usually revolved around basically losing as much life as possible. Early iterations getting to play like Gataxian Probe and Street Wraith to essentially accelerate like the life total loss while also getting to draw cards, because they would both get to draw a card for different reasons for playing the card. In versions nowadays, the quickest way of like losing tons of life is through Fetch Shocking, which means that you lose 3 life, casting Thought Seizes, which obviously you get to take your opponent's best card and then you lose 2 life, which ends up being an upside rather than a drawback on the card. You also have cards like Lightning Bolt that you can use to bolt yourself and lose life. And that's really kind of like the main ways to lose life in the deck. I'll be honest, I kind of ad-libbed the Lightning Bolt part of it because a lot of these decks did have a bunch of ways to lose more life in order to cast your Death Shadows as early as like turn 2 and turn 3. Nowadays, the most popular plays are using a fetch land to get a shock land, and then Thought Seizing your opponent, putting yourself to 15. And on turn 2, fetch shock puts you to 12, lets you be able to play 1/1 shadows. On top of all that, noticeably what's missing from this deck is the card Dress Down, which has been relegated to the sideboard. Dress Down makes creatures lose all abilities and then you sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. When you have all creatures lose abilities, in the case of like Death Shadow, it just is a 1 mana 13/13 straight up. Croxa, you could end up playing for 2 mana and don't have to worry about sacrificing when it enters the battlefield when casting it from your hand, because the Dress Down makes it lose all abilities. So some common interactions that were with the deck, but this version in particular is basically playing like a Grixis mid-range slash aggro slash kind of control deck. When you look at it from the fact that it can be aggressive, playing Ragavan or Dragon Rage Channeler on the early turn. Dragon Rage Channeler can also kind of mix into a mid-rangey type card for the fact that you could just cast non-creature spells. You can eventually get to Delirium. This thing will get to attack for 3 and gives you card advantage in a different way. I guess really more card selection than card advantage. Gives you some late game punch with Croxa, Titan of Death's Hunger. While I don't necessarily like Croxa, I've been an advocate for not playing Croxa in Modern for the fact that for the same reason that I don't like it. This deck gets to play like Unholy Heats. Other decks get to play the Solitudes and a bunch of like cheap removal and stuff that just exile Kroxa as well. But this deck can leverage a little bit more, just getting to escape it and then still maintain Delirium. So Kroxa in this deck is fine just because it gives you another big threat that your opponent must answer that you can even hold off to late in the game, and basically just kind of put your opponent into a hole and forcing them to draw answers for this Kroxa. You have Ledger Shredder, which kind of fits in the same vein as like Dragon Rage Channeler. I would say less aggressive than Dragon Rage Channeler, so definitely not the most ideal card to be playing like necessarily on turn 2, but playing like a turn 3 Ledger Shredder, even like a turn 2 Ledger Shredder followed up by Mishra's Bauble, can make Ledger Shredder bigger and make it pretty aggressive, depending on how aggressive that you want to be with your spells. But Ledger Shredder also just getting to help you get some card advantage and some card selection by looting away cards, getting rid of lands when you don't need them, getting rid of spells to make Ledger Shredder bigger, and of course get in for tons and tons of damage if going unchecked, and eventually actually growing out of Unholy Heat in Delirium range. So that's the creatures of the deck, all of them very important. Previous Death Shadow builds would keep it very slim on the threats, and you'd play a lot of like interaction and things like that. So definitely nice to see Grixis Shadow kind of going in a more aggressively slanted way, while having some resiliency and definitely getting some mana advantage as long with card advantage and card selection as well with these suite of creatures. That being said, we now have the spells and things like that that kind of go into the disruptive element of the of the reason why I like this deck. So this deck can be very disruptive and put on a fast clock. Like you have turn 1 Ragavans into like Thoughtseizes, into holding up Spell Pierce to kind of mess with some of the other decks. Spell Pierce also having some versatility against like the control decks and things like that. Can basically stop everything but Solitude from removing any one of your other creatures, and you're kind of okay with a 2-for-1 nowadays in these versions because they're usually dealing with Ragavan Dragon Rage Channeler, and while a Solitude on a Death Shadow would be pretty brutal because it turns off all your other Death Shadows, that's kind of why this deck I think plays 3 instead of 4. Because if they get rid of the other one, there's only 2 copies. Statistically speaking, like, you're not going to get hosed on 2 more copies, like you would 3 other ones if you were playing 4. You have Lightning Bolt, which is kind of a catch-all. Again, as I said earlier, it can be one of those spells that you end up dealing damage to yourself, which comes up probably more often than you expect, but not like so often where, you know, your opponent's going to see it as like an obvious play. Your opponents are more than likely not going to expect Bolt targeting yourself when your opponent decides to maybe Unholy Heat like a Death Shadow just straight up. Again, you have like Thoughtseize, probably one of your best cards in the deck, where it gets to take your opponent's best card. Thoughtseize is almost always, you know, one of your best turn 1 plays anyhow, besides like getting to play a turn 1 Ragavan. Just getting to clear away for like your Ledger Shredders, clear the way for like your Death Shadows and things like that on a later turn, you know, possibly turn 2 if you're able to go Fetch Shock Thoughtseize into Fetch Shock, play 2 Death Shadows, you know. Just some lines of play that you can consider when playing this deck. You have Unholy Heat as another 1 mana option, getting to deal 2 damage in the early game, gets rid of like Ragavans, Dragon Rage Channelers, any mana dorks and things like that, on top of getting to scale to the late game where you eventually get to kill Primeval Titans, messing around with like your opponent's hand and things like that. You can get rid of their Murktides with a Unholy Heat if you manage their graveyard decently well, and of course any other big dumb fatties that your opponents want to play. Going into the 2-drop slot, you have like Drown in the Lock and Expressive Iterations, both getting to do 2 very drastically different things. Drown in the Lock getting to counterspell or destroy a target creature with mana value less than or equal to the number of cards in its controller's graveyard. It's essentially a counterspell that gets to scale up to the late game, while also getting to like counter and tempo your opponent on turns where you get to leave it up. With the amount of like instant speed removal in cards like Spell Pierce, Lightning Bolt, Unholy Heat, and Terminate, and even like Hooligan's Command to a degree. Drown in the Lock, holding up in the early game is fine, and definitely getting to hold up in the late game. It essentially becomes like a counterspell. The mana restriction of being blue and black is a little bit more helpful than double blue for the fact that you want to be getting like Blood Crypt a lot of the time. So it's very feasible that you just have Blood Crypt and a like a Steam Vents or like a Watery Grave to be able to cast like a Drown in the Loch. Expressive Iteration, on the other hand, is a card that can single-handedly enable like Ledger Shredders in different ways. So Expressive Iteration lets you look at the top 3 cards. One goes to the hand, one goes to the bottom of the library, one goes into exile, and then you can play the exiled card this turn. The fact that you have Mishra's Bauble in your deck means that on turn 2 you could just put a land in your hand or just another spell. You can exile a Bauble and then bottom another like uncastable card that you don't need, and obviously get value from the Expressive Iteration by getting to play the exiled card. And that's where Expressive Iteration is at its best, when you're using it on like turn 3 to hit your 3rd land drop, or even on turn 2 just getting to find a Bauble and continue to draw more cards, because essentially you get to see 4 cards, drawing 2 of the one of your best ones, and then just a random one after the fact for 2 mana. Get a little bit of information on your opponent. It's just obviously one of the reasons why it was banned in Pioneer, just being one of the best cantrips, and in Modern it is also continuing to be one of the best cantrips in the format, and why 4-color decks and things like that pick it up, and why blue-red based decks want to play this card very badly as well. You have 1/ofs of Terminate, Kolaghan's Command. Kolaghan's Command allows you to be pretty grindy, definitely getting rid of like an annoying artifact, or getting to make your opponent discard a card. You have some neat tricks where if you and your opponent are in top deck mode, Kolaghan's Command can deal a little bit of damage to them, or even deal a little bit of damage to yourself to improve your Death Shadows, or even get them to discard a card, pick up a creature, basically getting to put a threat into your hand while getting rid of your opponent's possible interaction to deal with it. Choose if they choose to draw it on essentially that specific turn. Terminate is just a straight up removal spell. Creature can't be regenerated. The regenerated part not mattering too much, but Terminate being an instant speed removal spell for creatures where this deck doesn't really want to be dealing with a lot of creatures that want to come off the board, and in the cases of like Amulet Titan and in the most popular decks in Murktide, it's just a straight up answer to Murktide. So a good thing to keep in mind. Mishra's Bauble, in kind of the case of Dress Down, there's a lot of different interactions and things like that that you can, and tricks that you can do with Mishra's Bauble, like you can do with Dress Down. Bauble just being a way to look at your own card when you have a fetch land in play, whether it's turn 1, getting to decide if you want to draw that card and leading with the shock land, or even not fetching at all to then draw that card and playing in a different sequence, getting to Bauble your opponent and just kind of get that information from them, you know, every turn with Mishra's Baubles, like way back when you could do it with Luris and things like that. RIP to the boy. Mishra's Bauble is just a card that has just those simple base level tricks that I think if you understand how those work, you can start getting into some more convoluted lines with it and just be able to eke out some more wins and some more advantage and maximize the amount of value that you get in Mishra's Bauble by having a 0-mana artifact in your deck and essentially getting to play with 56 cards in your deck. Really quickly, with how the deck is constructed, since we do not have any repeating mana symbols, kind of another reason why you would play like Drown in the Loch over Counterspell, even though probably more of the other reasons, like if this deck could play Counterspell, it probably would. You get to play Jangotha, just a free card. You don't need that 14th or that 15th card in your sideboard. So Jangotha just being a free companion that you get to play that ends up being like another threat is pretty good in my book. The mana base is super simple. You get to play Snow-Covered Mountain, Snow-Covered Swamp, I'm assuming because those are technically optimal. But of course you get to play 3 Scalding Tarns, you get 4 Polluted Delta, you get the 4 Bloodstained Mire, then you get to play 2, 2, and 2 of each of the Shocklands in the Grixis colors. You want to play as many Shockland or as many fetch lands as possible. Playing 11 is plenty in your 19 land deck to essentially lose the most amount of life possible. Of course, it also gives you the most flexibility in color fixing, which this deck wants to do with the slew of Rakdos and Izzet colored spells, splashing in some of the Dimir colored spells as well. With the sideboard, you have engineered explosives for like the Rhinos decks and possibly even Chalices too, because Chalice on 1 can be pretty brutal for this deck to play through, which doesn't have any favors done for it when you need to have just one color. But of course, you can pay like double blue, double black, so on, etc. into engineered explosives, make it 2 converted mana cost, but come into play with 1 counter. Just a trick that you can remember. You don't have to necessarily pay up to 5, where 5 is each different color or whatnot. So definitely some good things to know. Alpine Moon can answer Urza Sagas and the like. Name Valakuts as well, so you don't just die to them, especially when your opponent doesn't need that many mountains to kill you when you're trying to make your life total very low. Another spell Pierce for a little bit more disruption. Collective Brutality, being a way to kind of like really hard tempo your opponent, discarding a card to like kill one of their dorks, and then like thought gets you to rust their hand. Getting rid of like a removal spell, or maybe like in some of the cases like collected companies and things like that, can be very positive. Also, there is sometimes where like you could just use this straight up reach to eventually kill your opponent. Just hopefully you are not at 11 life with a Death Shadow in play when you decide to use the Drain ability. Dress Down, of course, has 1,000,001 different interactions and different rules, questions, and a card that we could be on for hours just talking about. Specifically in this deck, a lot of the things that you get to use, like Death Shadow and Croxa, just on the base level, while also getting to mess with like your opponent's Ragavans, their Dragon Rage Channelers, some of their creatures as well, on top of the other neat interactions that Dress Down comes with. Also has the 3 best words in Magic in a draw card staple to it. More Terminates, Unlicensed, or really just Terminates. I thought it was Unlicensed Disintegration. That is not a card that people are playing in Modern. Terminate, just more hard removal. Turok, Dread Cantor against like the 4-color and 5-color like Omnath / used to be Yori and like control decks, just for the fact that later in the game you just get to kick this, make your opponent him to Turok, discard 2 cards at random. Protection from white, so it can't be hit by the Solitudes, which is a big game against those decks, because that's one of like their best ways to try and win the game while also getting to deal with like Turok. Plus, if Turok just eats like a Fury, that means that they have to save their Solitudes and stuff like that for these other knuckleheads. And of course, an unchecked Turok for multiple turns can just end the game on its own. Unlicensed Hearse, a way to mess with the graveyard, also ends up being a big creature that dodges sorcery speed removal. I guess sorcery speed removal that isn't targeted towards artifacts. You have Kolaghan's Command as well to deal with kind of like opposing Unlicensed Hearse, because you do care about your graveyard to some degree while not being super all in on it. And of course, just bringing it against like the grindier decks and things like that. Makes it very hard to beat you when you can just rebuy some of your best creatures, you know, every so many turns, and then also get to like disrupt their draw steps and things like that. So that is the long-winded explanation of the Grixis Death Shadow deck. Just to reiterate, I believe this deck is good, and I think is always good for 2 reasons. One, when people don't expect Grixis Death Shadow, and it's not really a popular deck in the meta, that's when the deck ends up being very, very good and can end up being well positioned. I think even with Solitudes and stuff like that running around, the fact that you are a deck that plays Ragavan, it can play it on turn 1, and if it just goes unchecked for even a turn, you can just get insane amounts of value from this deck just for that reason. 2, it does something that I really love in Modern, and that is just being super flexible and being a deck that can get to the board very early with creatures, kind of in the way that the Isn't Murktide decks do. Getting on the board early with like Ragavan, Dragon Rage Channeler, Ledger Strider, and also having 2 threats in this case that I think that scale to the late game, and Death Shadow and Croxa, while also getting to play disruptive elements like Spell Pierce and Thoughtseize to essentially punish like the combo decks, while also having game against some of the control decks and some of the other like aggressive / mid-range decks as well. Getting to play like Unholy Heats, Drawn on the Locks as more disruption, and probably the best cantrip in the format as well. It just has a nice mix of cards that get you value and obviously are very, very good in some matchups, but not completely dead in other matchups, and are probably about like a 50-50 on like copies that you would shave later in the game and stuff. So I like Grixis Death Shadow. It's a deck that has always grown on me. It's been my pet deck forever. I like moved off of it last year, and it's always a deck that just stays around, manages to find a way to stay relevant, and I think even now is at least like a halfway decent pick in the format if you're willing to commit to a lot of like the intricacies that the deck does offer. So if this is a video that you enjoyed and you want to see more videos like this, of course, leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. It's two of the easiest ways that you can support me and my content. Again, there's a link in the description to the Discord server. Go ahead and follow that link, join, talk about the deck, talk about any of the other stuff that is involved in the Modern Pioneer format and other Magic stuff. I love giving my opinions, talking about people through their ideas and things like that. And yeah, that's going to do it for me in this video. I love you all. Of course, stay tuned for more videos coming in the future, and I hope to see you all in the next video.